She has been published in Plowshares, The New Yorker, Ninth Letter, Gulf Coast, The New York Times Book Review, and Tin House, among many other notable magazines. She is the author of 2 books, The Wonderful Ms. Hempel Chronicles, a PEN/Faulkner Award finalist and a Story Prize Notable Book of 2008. Her novel, Madeline is Sleeping, is the National Book Award finalist and winner of the Janet Heidinger Kafka Prize, described by both the Boston Globe and the Los Angeles Times as luminous, a word that seems to me applicable to her work as a whole. She is a daring, innovative writer whose work is preoccupied with adult anxiety over the mysterious realm of childhood, and this reader at least is delighted. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Bynum.
This is called The Young Wife's Tale, but she could no longer see what they spoke of. She saw only the face most familiar to her, the most dear. It was as if over time her tender stare had sifted over his face and settled there, on his forehead, his eyelids, his cheekbones, his mouth, hiding from her what was beautiful in him. She had thought, like Psyche, like all the other curious young wives, that she might creep up on her husband while he lay unconscious, a small circle of light held in her hand, and spy the secret face that had so long remained invisible to her. Psyche had believed she would find a serpent, another wife a troll, and what did they find but beauty? Their fair husbands had vanished like smoke. But why should Eva think of those old stories? The magnificent castles, the unseen servants. Imagine those wives in an apartment. Could enchantment take hold among the recycling bins, the sickly houseplants, the student loan letters? When the match sparked and the wick flared, all Eva saw was her husband's face, neither stunning nor monstrous, the face that she loved. Wax did not drip from her candle. The spell went unbroken. He stayed right where he was, fast asleep. For the first time, the king appeared alone in Eva's dream, standing atop a dry and windy hill. His cloak flapped roughly about his legs, and above him the sky glowed with a strange luminosity. Heavy gray clouds moved low and swift over a scrim of sheer, pearly light. The clouds were edged in gold and vermilion, and seemed to portend that some stirring, unknowable change was on its way. But the king did not gaze at the mysterious sky, the dark gilded clouds sweeping overhead. He kept his eyes fixed on the barren ground. He ran his open hand over a brittle tuft of grass. He turned over a small stone with his boot. Suddenly he fell to his knees, his cloak gusting up behind him, and brought his face close to the turf. What he found excited him. Hurrying on in an urgent, uneven gait, half scrambling, half running, trying to stay low to the ground, the king followed a path of signs discernible only to him. Eva could not guess what he was seeking. Her perspective was puzzling. In one blink, she saw the king as a distant figure, stark against the toiling sky, and in another, she could see the tiny flecks of brightness in the stone he overturned. Where am I? She wondered, and at the very moment the question arose, she felt beneath her palms the cool, papery surface of a birch. She was lost in a stand of ravishingly white, naked trees, and at the very moment she knew she was lost, she also understood she would be found. It was she the king was searching for. Stepping through the pale trees, their white arms touching her, she drew closer and closer until at last she appeared on the edge of the wood, the wind filling her nightgown like a sail. The king looked up from the ground and saw her. Then Eva awoke in the darkness of the bedroom. Her heart had slowed to a languorous throb. She felt as if she were surfacing from a sleep that resembled death. She wanted to reach for the hand of her husband, but found herself too entranced, too abandoned to do so. Though she could not lift her head, she became dimly aware of a reddish gleam at the foot of the bed, and wondered if, having dreamt this dream, she was destined to go up in flames, the bed a pyre, a shimmering blanket of fire enfolding her. But she was not. Through the lowered veil of her lashes, she made out embers burning in a grate. Through the remnants of her dream, she smelled the ancient scent of wood smoke. She heard the ticking of cinders falling into ash. Opening her eyes, she saw above her a low ceiling, black beams of wood, a small window hanging bright and faceted as a jewel. The room was not her own. Her husband was not beside her. In the first days of the king, there was a girl who wandered far into the forest. At dusk, she would come home with a scratched face and torn skirts and brambles stuck like pins in her hair to find her husband sitting before a hearth gone cold, a dirty pot caked with gruel. But how his eyes would shine when she appeared. He draws out her seat. He brings in water. He makes her a thin soup, which she plays with her spoon. She smiles at him shyly, saying, "I think I lost my sense of time." One evening, the dusk turns into darkness, and still the girl has not returned. Her husband runs to the edge of the forest, a torch in his hand. All night he searches for her, the trees looming around him, and by morning he stumbles out from the woods, bewildered and afraid, having found no sign of her. The other wives are washing clothes in the stream. They bend down farther over their work, as if by doing so they might make themselves invisible. The young husband approaches them, his face a wound, his voice hoarse, when he asks them, "Have you seen her?" The women, up to their elbows in cold water, shake their heads. They are silent. Eva imagined the silence into which her husband would awake. She imagined his voice in the empty room, saying her name. She heard clearly the variations he would use. Evita, avuncular, the joyful, thoughtless ornamenting of the word he most liked to say. The names would chime and shiver in the air. Evel Knievel? He would ask, and there would be no answer. She had been taken too far away. In a strange bed, in a strange room, she felt the anguish of her husband as her own. It felt like knives, like brats gnawing, like broken glass, like poison bubbling. No, it felt like something else. Exactly. All it took were 2 slippery pills, swallowed at the clinic, and then a bus ride home and straight into bed. The pain began as a little pang in her gut, and then, whoosh, she was possessed by it. Her husband, not yet her husband, knelt beside the bed with a cool washcloth in his hand as she writhed around like a snake, sweating through the sheets. And just as swiftly, it was over. The pain disappeared and the bleeding began. The whole thing lasted only an afternoon. In the evening, the 2 of them walked around the neighborhood, eating ice cream. To say they had made a decision would suggest that they had needed to have a conversation. Neither one had said, "Given the smallness of our apartment and the narrowness of the stairs, considering where we are in our lives." She didn't even have to mention her wedding dress, which was already paid for, already fitted, sitting hugely and steadfastly on her credit card. It was made of silk organza and floated up behind her when she moved. It was the color of champagne. In this strange bed, in this close room, beneath the tiny jewel of a window, she thought of her husband and felt again the ache of that dreamlike afternoon. Or at least she did for a little while. A shockingly, shamefully little while. For how could she stay sad when the king himself was watching her, sitting alert by the fire? As she saw his dark eyes gleaming in the light, her sorrow for her husband dwindled into a low, melancholy note above which her false heart trilled. The king, the brave and ravaged and beautiful king. What might he say to her? What might he see? There was always the possibility he could love her, wasn't there? There was always the possibility. If her young marriage had taught her anything, it was that. The surprise, the stark miracle of love bent in her direction. So why not the king, watching silently from his chair? She felt his eyes move over her, touching each part of her deliberately, like a hand. The next time Eva awoke, in the darkness of the bedroom, her heart was brimming, beating lightly as a bird's. The heaviness that had pulled on her was lifted. She yawned enormously, stretching her limbs to the far corners of the bed. At the end of the room, a ruddy light glowed, but rising up onto her elbows, she saw that it belonged to the unsteady street lamp outside her apartment window. And above her was her ceiling, still haunted by the water stain. The crooked blinds, the seething radiator. Did the sound of its spitting mean she was back, the dream over? More likely, more tormenting, the dream continued, and she had been simply ejected from it. For there sat her umbrella, her shoes. There lay the novel she was reading, prostrate on the floor, her crumpled socks, his sway-backed boots, his corduroy pants, upright and perfectly accordioned. They spoke of the lovely, unflustered motion with which he had loosened them, allowed them to drop down the length of his legs, neatly stepped clear of them, and then plunged into the bed. Her husband, his watch resting on the bureau, his stack of hermetically sealed comic books, the photograph of his mother and father and sisters on the wall, his harmonica glinting, his collection of fortune cookie fortunes in a jar. All the things about him she adored, infinite and ordinary as the stars. She reached for his hand. She slid her foot across the sheets, seeking his leg. She rolled over voluptuously in anticipation of the warm obstacle that would stop her. But she rolled unhindered all the way to the edge. Nothing prevented her, nothing held. She had the cool expanse entirely to herself. Her husband was no longer there. He's coming right back, she thought. He'll be here in a heartbeat. Because maybe he wanted a glass of water, or else drank too many before he went to bed. Maybe he heard footsteps on the stairs and was waiting, dictionary raised, behind the door. Maybe he was saving them. Maybe he was thirsty. Or maybe, like her, he had fallen in love with the gypsy queen and her raven hair, the tiny girl tucked inside a tulip, the mermaid, the shield maiden, the daughter crying from the tower. Maybe it was the siren who had called to him, and maybe he had answered and was gone. This story was initially sparked by an enormous crush I had on a particular cinematic character. After I got married just around the same time that the second Lord of the Rings movie came out, and found myself seriously thinking that my marriage was at risk due to the very serious feelings I had. And it wasn't Viggo Mortensen. I was like, it's not Viggo, it's Aragorn. Like, I sort of initially kind of resisted doing the women are washing in the streams. I was like, oh, this sounds like Xena the Warrior Princess. You know, like you don't want to kind of have that kind of like ancient patina on the story. And so I think I was like really excited to get to the moments where I could populate the story with espresso machines and student loan letters. Like I really wanted some of that contemporary texture as a means of offsetting that sort of ancient tale tone, because as much as I love writing in it, because I love tales and I clearly love ancient epics, I also felt like the danger of it then kind of floating off into Fantasyland, and was relieved to have some sort of grimy contemporary texture to be able to offset it with.